She booked the first-class ticket. She paid for it. She dressed with dignity. But the moment Zaria Monroe stepped onto that flight, a single glance from a white executive changed everything. They told her her seat was out of service. The crew looked away. The cabin fell silent. And the voice in her chest, one she'd buried since childhood, rose with quiet fire. Who was Zaria Monroe? Really? Just another black woman with ambition? Or something much more dangerous to the world she was stepping into a mirror? Why did the airline CEO hide their connection? Why was she really removed from that seat? And how did this one flight become the spark that lit up global headlines, courtroom reckonings, and a truth-telling speech heard across continents? This isn't just a story about racism on a plane. It's a story about silence, power, and a daughter who decided the sky no longer belonged to the few. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Now, fasten your seatbelt. Let's begin. The hum of the jet bridge was low and steady as Zaria Monroe stepped onto Flight 316, her heels soft against the navy carpet. The first-class cabin greeted her with a scent that reminded her of home-fresh linen mixed with something sharper, like cedar and lemon. A steward to her left nodded politely. She returned the gesture with a faint smile, even though her mind was already far ahead. She carried nothing but a laptop bag and a small tote, efficient, curated, unbothered by excess. Her boarding pass read Seat 2A, a window seat. She always chose window seats. They made the world feel small for a while, manageable, framed. Zaria had spent the night before triple-checking her portfolio. She wasn't just flying to Zurich. She was flying toward the moment that had lived in her vision board for over a decade, the unveiling of the Horizon Green Line Tower, a sustainable, vertical forest wrapped in steel and silence. Her mind flicked through mental checklists as she approached her row. Media deck, confirmed. Model walkthrough file, confirmed. Slide deck with translated captions for German investors, confirmed. She was ready, or at least as ready as someone like her could ever afford to be. She arrived at her seat and placed her bag under the footrest. She ran her hand across the armrest. Cool leather. Everything was in order. She sat down and adjusted the hem of her navy blazer. Her nails were neutral-toned and neat. Her curls were pulled back into a low, elegant bun. The kind of look that said, yes, I belong here, and no, I won't be explaining it. The boarding announcements played in the background, muffled slightly by the hum of passengers loading in behind her. She stared out the window at the blinking lights of the tarmac. Steam lifted from the concrete in faint wisps, a reminder of the late summer humidity in New York. And then, she felt that sensation of being watched. It was subtle. Not the kind of stare that was hungry or curious, but the kind that weighed you. She turned slightly. A woman in her late 60s stood in the aisle, eyeing Zaria with the fixed disapproval of someone who had already decided how the world should look and who didn't belong where. The woman was tall and thin, draped in a beige cashmere coat despite the season, and wore pearls that glinted under the cabin lights. Her lipstick was the color of bruised wine. She looked from Zaria to the seat number placard above, then back to Zaria. Zaria gave a polite nod. The woman didn't return it. "Excuse me," the woman said, not moving. "I believe you're in my seat." Zaria blinked slowly, measured. She tapped the screen of her phone, pulling up the Ventura Air app. She tilted it slightly toward the woman. "Seat 2A," she said calmly. "That's what's listed here." The woman's eyes narrowed. "There must be a mistake. I've flown in that seat for over 10 years. Zaria raised an eyebrow gently. She leaned back in her seat, keeping her voice steady. I'm sure it's a great seat. But I have a confirmed ticket. A young flight attendant, Greg, appeared from the galley. His name tag was crooked. He had a nervous smile and eyes that darted between the two women like a tennis match. Is there a problem here? He asked, lightly out of breath. This woman is in my seat, the older woman said. Her voice clipped. Zaria didn't respond right away. She let Greg look at her, then back at the boarding pass, then at her again. Greg smiled awkwardly. Ma'am, could I just see your boarding pass one more time? Just to double-check, Zaria hesitated for the briefest second. She didn't want to hand it over, not because she had anything to hide, but because she'd already shown it once. Because something in the tone reminded her of 5th grade, of being asked to reprove things others took for granted. Still, she complied, silently, professionally. Greg looked it over. His eyebrows twitched in confusion. Then he looked at the older woman. Mrs. Caldwell, may I see yours as well? The woman handed over a paper ticket. First class? Yes. But seat 2B. Greg's face changed. He turned to her. Looks like you're in the aisle seat, just beside her. Mrs. Caldwell frowned. She didn't move. There must be a glitch, she said. I always book 2A. I even told your phone rep 2 days ago that I wanted my usual seat. Greg offered the practiced smile of someone who'd had this conversation before. I understand, ma'am, but it looks like 2A is already confirmed under Ms. Monroe here. Mrs. Caldwell let out a light chuckle. It wasn't kind. Oh. Come now, she said. She must have gotten a last-minute upgrade. Zaria inhaled quietly. Then she turned. No, she said, voice firm. This was booked by my firm. Paid in full. No upgrade. No charity. The words hung in the air. Too sharp to be casual. Too soft to be defiant. Greg stepped back slightly. Let me double-check something in the system. I'll be right back. As he walked away, the woman, Mrs. Caldwell, turned and muttered something under her breath. Zaria caught only the end. They always think they're entitled now. Her jaw clenched for half a breath. But she didn't move, didn't rise. She simply folded her hands on her lap and looked out the window again. Let the storm come. She had weathered worse. Behind her eyelids, she whispered to herself the same thing she always did in moments like this. Be water. Be wind. Be still. But never be silent. Greg returned 5 minutes later. His posture had shifted slightly, more upright this time, like someone who'd just been spoken to by a supervisor. He was trying to maintain a calm exterior, but the nervous tapping of his pen against the digital tablet betrayed him. Thank you both for your patience, he began, eyes darting between Zaria and Mrs. Caldwell. I've spoken with our gate manager, Ms. Monroe. Your seat assignment is confirmed. There is no error in the system. Zaria gave a small nod. Her lips pressed together. Mrs. Caldwell, on the other hand, did not take the news as quietly. I don't understand how this could happen, she said, her voice rising just enough to attract the attention of other passengers. I've been flying Ventura since 1989. I'm a Platinum Privilege member. This is simply unacceptable. A man in seat 1C turned his head, trying not to look, but clearly listening. A woman behind them leaned forward slightly. Greg kept his tone level. We understand and appreciate your loyalty, ma'am, but every seat assignment is processed through our booking system. It's not guaranteed based on previous travel. Mrs. Caldwell crossed her arms and looked down at Zaria again. She didn't sit. Zaria kept her gaze on the window. Greg hesitated, then offered, "If you'd like, I can check if seat 4A is still open. It's another window seat on the same side." Mrs. Caldwell didn't answer right away. She stood there for several more seconds, as if waiting for Zaria to offer something, a concession, an apology, anything. But Zaria didn't flinch. Her silence was her response. She wouldn't barter for the right to be where she already belonged. Finally, Mrs. Caldwell gave a curt nod. "Fine. I'll take 4A." Greg exhaled quietly, then motioned for her to follow. As they walked off, Mrs. Caldwell muttered to herself again. Zaria didn't catch the full sentence, but she heard the word manners. It stung, not because it was loud, but because it echoed something older than this plane in this moment. She closed her eyes. She was tired. Not physically, but emotionally. Tired of always having to read between the lines. Tired of rehearsing what she'd say in moments like this, just in case. Tired of preparing to prove. The engine outside the window shifted as power surged through the turbines. The soft vibration filled the cabin. People were still boarding, children talking, a man sneezing, the world continuing, indifferent. Zaria unclenched her fists. She reached down for her bag and pulled out her notebook. It was leather-bound and worn on the corners. Inside were sketches of her buildings, her ideas, her notes scribbled in the margins like little prayers. She turned to a blank page. She began to draw. Lines, angles, a quiet rhythm. Her mother used to say, "When the world doesn't make sense, build something that does." The seat beside her remained empty for now. A flight attendant passed by offering water bottles. Zaria declined with a polite shake of her head, and then came another voice. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" She looked up. A man, mid-30s, stood holding a slim black carry-on. He wore a navy linen suit without a tie. His skin was bronze, his hair curled just slightly at the edges, and his eyes were the kind that noticed everything. "Seat 2B?" he asked. Zaria nodded. "Yes, that's you." He slid in beside her with practiced ease. "I'm Marcus Levin." She offered a handshake. "Zaria Monroe." He paused just a beat too long. "Zaria Monroe, of Harbor and Knox." She smiled faintly. "Guilty. I read about the Green Line Tower." "That's yours. I led the design team." "Yes." He whistled low. "That's brilliant. You're making architecture do what policy failed to." "That's no small thing." Zaria blinked, caught off guard by the recognition. She offered a humble, quiet, "Thank you." Marcus settled in. "I'm heading to Zurich for a green energy summit. Horizon's one of the sites we're modeling for carbon-neutral infrastructure in emerging cities." Her eyebrows lifted. "You're with the UN contracted." "Yes. Energy Systems Advisory." They fell into quiet conversation, natural, grounded. It felt like a window had cracked open in a pressure-sealed room. But just as Zaria began to exhale, a loud voice interrupted from behind. "She shouldn't even be up here." Zaria and Marcus turned slightly in their seats. It was a man in 3C, leaning across the aisle and talking far louder than necessary to the woman beside him. "You know they give upgrades now just to meet quotas. Look around. They're turning this into a bus." Zaria said nothing. Marcus shifted beside her, his jaw flexed. But he didn't speak either. The comment wasn't made directly to them, and yet it was made exactly for them to hear. Zaria stared ahead, a quiet burn behind her eyes. She'd done everything right, paid full fare, dressed like diplomacy, spoke with care, and still, she felt the invisible cost being added to her presence. Marcus finally spoke, low enough for her alone to hear. Do you want me to say something? Zaria shook her head. Her voice was almost a whisper. No, I don't need you to speak for me. I just need you to witness. He nodded, understanding something deeper in that moment than any policy report could teach. The flight attendants began their final cabin checks. Seatbelts clicked, bags settled. As the cabin dimmed and the overhead lights flickered to a soft amber glow, Zaria leaned back into her seat. She looked out the window again. The lights of the tarmac began to blur as the engines roared to life. She wasn't just flying to Zurich, she was flying against gravity. And gravity came in more forms than physics. Sometimes it was a woman in pearls. Sometimes it was a whisper behind you. But sometimes gravity was also inside you, a force that said keep going anyway. The wheels lifted off the runway with a muted thud, and the aircraft tilted gently skyward. Zaria felt the familiar sensation of her stomach pulling back as they ascended. She focused on her breathing, in through the nose, out through the mouth. Not from fear of flying. That wasn't it. It was the accumulation of everything before takeoff, the looks, the whispers, the uninvited commentary. Each moment on its own was forgettable, but together they stacked like bricks on her chest. Marcus said nothing for the first 10 minutes. He respected her quiet, letting it fill the space between them like steam after a long storm. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, handing out menus. Dinner service would begin shortly, but Zaria wasn't hungry. She stared down at her sketchbook again. This time, she wasn't drawing, just flipping pages. Past a city park she had designed on the south end of Atlanta, past a blueprint for a women's shelter that never got funded, past a scribbled quote from her mother-built places where people feel they belong. That's more radical than any monument. Zaria stopped at a blank page. She picked up her pen. Her hand hovered. Nothing came. She sighed quietly and closed the notebook. You okay? Marcus asked gently. She nodded. Yeah, just thinking. His voice remained soft. If you ever want to talk about what happened before I sat down, I'll listen. Zaria turned slightly toward him. Her face was unreadable, calm but clouded. She held his gaze for a moment. Have you ever been somewhere you clearly belonged, but everyone around you acted like you didn't? Marcus leaned back. Yeah, he said, more times than I'd like to count. But it never gets easier. Does it? Zaria looked down. Her fingers traced the edge of her seat's armrest. I bought this ticket months ago, she said. Paid full fare. Picked the seat on purpose. It was supposed to be symbolic. First class. My first international design conference. Zurich. The panel's all white men. I was meant to be the outlier, but I didn't think I'd be fighting for my seat before we even took off. Marcus stayed quiet, absorbing every word. It's not just the seat, she continued. It's everything that came with it. The look that said I must have made a mistake. The assumption that I didn't earn this. The insult that pretended to be polite. I'm just tired of having to prove it. She wasn't angry. She was honest. And that honesty hung in the air like a weightless truth. Marcus nodded slowly. Sometimes, I think we carry more than we show. We absorb the friction just to keep moving forward. She gave him a faint smile. You sound like my therapist. He grinned. She must be good. There was a short pause, and then the plane gave a sudden jolt. A sharp tremor rippled through the fuselage. Zaria gripped the armrest instinctively. The captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a patch of turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Another shake. A few gasps from the cabin. Zaria closed her eyes. Not from fear, but from the irony of it. Even the sky was unstable today. Marcus watched her carefully. "You all right?" She nodded, eyes still closed. "I'm not afraid of turbulence. I'm used to it." A beat passed. Then she opened her eyes and said softly, "That was a metaphor." He smiled. "I caught it." Dinner arrived soon after. Zaria accepted hers, but only picked at the chicken. Marcus took a few bites of the salmon, but left most of it untouched. The clinking of forks, murmurs of passengers, and white noise of altitude settled into the cabin like a lullaby. After dinner, the cabin lights dimmed. Zaria rested her head against the window. Marcus leaned slightly toward her. "Do you ever think about stopping, like walking away from all of it?" Zaria considered the question. "Sometimes," she said, "but then I remember that if I stop, someone else might never start. Visibility matters, so I stay, even when it costs more than it should." Marcus exhaled, low and slow. "That's strength, not the kind people put in speeches, the kind that builds over years in silence." A silence settled between them again, comfortable this time, like a shared understanding. But it didn't last. The man in 3C spoke again, louder this time, though still pretending to talk only to his seatmate. "She gets to sit there and talk about her little buildings like she changed the world. They hand out praise these days like Halloween candy. Participation trophies in concrete." Marcus shifted. Zaria didn't move. The words didn't land like before, not because they were any less cruel, but because Zaria had already reinforced her skin. Still, Marcus looked at her, eyebrows raised in question. She whispered, "Don't give him what he wants." So Marcus smiled slow and wide and spoke clearly into the air without turning his head. "You know, some people build towers. Some people just throw stones at them." The woman beside the man in 3C let out a soft gasp. Zaria covered her mouth, suppressing a quiet laugh. The man said nothing. The tension receded. Later, as the cabin settled deeper into night, Marcus fell asleep. Zaria remained awake, watching the clouds drift beneath them like soft rivers of smoke. She thought of her father. He had passed when she was 17, a gentleman who never made it past community college, but taught her about blueprints like they were bedtime stories. "You measure with vision, baby girl," he used to say. "Then you build with heart." She blinked back tears. She missed him most in moments like these, moments he never got to see. She whispered into the quiet, "I made it, Daddy." The cabin was dark. The clouds rolled on, and Zaria, daughter of builders, survivor of silences, sat in her rightful seat at 37,000 feet. She wasn't just flying to a conference. She was reclaiming altitude. The plane hummed with a steady drone as most of the cabin sank into slumber. First class had gone quiet, wrapped in half light and the muted rustle of blankets. Outside, the moon hung low over the wing, its glow silvering the clouds like ice on a frozen lake. Zaria sat motionless, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Her dinner tray had long been cleared. Her sketchbook closed on her lap. Beside her, Marcus slept with a calm stillness, arms crossed gently, head tilted back. She should have been tired, too. But sleep wouldn't come. Her thoughts were too loud. She had replayed the boarding scene at least 10 times in her head. The passive-aggressive smile from the gate agent. The low murmur that followed her down the aisle. The disbelieving look from the man in 3C. She wasn't new to racism. She wasn't naive. but something about it happening in the air at 30,000 feet, where everyone pretended to be civilized, made it sting sharper. She reached down and adjusted her seatbelt, more out of habit than need. She thought of her mother. That woman never once let injustice slide. At the grocery store, at church, at school board meetings, she would stare people down and speak with a calm so piercing it made racists flinch. Zaria had always admired that. But she'd also been afraid of inheriting the fire. She wanted to build things, not burn them down. Still, there was heat in her now, a low, quiet heat rising in her chest. The call button above her blinked softly. She hesitated. Then she pressed it. A chime echoed faintly. A minute later, a flight attendant approached. A young woman, blonde hair tied into a neat twist. Badge reading Tiffany. Tiffany gave a polite smile. The kind practiced 100 times in training? Yes. Ma'am Zaria nodded slightly. May I ask for the name of the head purser for this flight? Tiffany blinked. Is something wrong? Zaria didn't answer immediately. She spoke slowly, clearly. I'd just like to speak with whoever's in charge of the cabin crew. Tiffany hesitated. Of course. I'll let her know. She disappeared down the aisle. Marcus stirred. His eyes fluttered open, still groggy. You okay? Zaria didn't look at him. I pressed the call button. He sat up straighter. Everything all right? She nodded. Yes. But I'm not staying silent this time. Minutes later, a tall woman appeared in the aisle. Her uniform was immaculate. She wore a deep blue blazer, a silver pin in the shape of a dove, and a badge that read, J. Lovell, head purser. Miss Monroe? She asked. Zaria sat up fully. Yes, thank you for coming. The woman offered a polite but distant smile. I was told you asked to speak with me. Zaria's voice remained composed. I'd like to formally note an incident of discriminatory treatment that occurred during boarding. Ms. Lovell's expression didn't change. Would you mind explaining what happened? Zaria nodded. I was questioned by the gate agent, delayed in entering the cabin, and indirectly accused by a passenger of being in the wrong seat. I was asked to produce my boarding pass twice. The tone and assumptions were clearly racially coded. There was no apology, no correction. Lovell's mouth pressed into a line. Do you know the name of the gate agent? Zaria shook her head. No, but I imagine it's in your system, Marcus added quietly. I witnessed it. I can confirm her account. Lovell looked at him, eyes narrowing slightly. Perhaps she was beginning to realize Zaria wasn't alone. I see, she said finally. Would you like to file a written complaint? Yes, Zaria replied, but not anonymously. I want this to be on record. This isn't about compensation, it's about accountability. Lovell hesitated. Then she pulled a small tablet from her satchel. She tapped a few times, brought up a form. Zaria dictated the details calmly, precisely, like an architect reading blueprints. Passenger Zaria Monroe, Seat 2A, Flight VA 227, boarded at JFK. Incidents occurred between gate and boarding. Witness Marcus Levin, Seat 2B. She signed it electronically. Lovell didn't smile when she took back the device, but her voice softened. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. I'll make sure it's submitted. As she turned to leave, Marcus spoke up. One more thing, he said. I think your crew should know that Zaria Monroe is one of the youngest architects to ever keynote at the Zurich Civic Design Forum. Her presence on this flight is a credit to Ventura Air, not a problem to be questioned. Lovell paused. Her face betrayed a flicker of surprise. Then she nodded. Duly noted. When she was gone, Zaria turned to him. You didn't have to say that? I know, Marcus said, but it's true, and sometimes truth needs an audience. Zaria stared at him for a long moment. Thank you, she said softly. A small smile returned to her lips, not from victory, but from something smaller, more precious. The feeling of being seen without needing to perform. Later that night, turbulence rocked the plane again, more intense this time. The seatbelt sign flickered back on. A child in the back cried out. A beverage cart was locked hastily. Zaria gripped her seat, but her mind was elsewhere. She was replaying every moment of her professional journey. The time she was told her hair looked too unpolished for a client meeting. The lunch she sat through where a developer mistook her for an assistant. The intern who once whispered, "You don't look like an architect." All the things that didn't break her, but scraped. Marcus looked over at her. You ever think about what you'd say if the world actually listened? Zaria didn't answer right away. Then she said quietly, I think I'd say, stop asking us to prove we belong. Start asking why the room looks the way it does. Marcus nodded. That's a sermon. Zaria turned back to the window. The moon had shifted, a subtle tilt of light, as if the sky itself had turned its head. And beneath that shifting light, she whispered to herself, not today. She would not be made small, not in her seat, not in her skin, not in the sky. The turbulence passed, but the tension in Zaria's chest did not. The cabin lights dimmed further for the overnight stretch. Overhead, the stars blinked faintly outside the oval windows, little reminders of a larger world that felt strangely irrelevant when compressed inside a flying capsule of strained smiles and half-warm blankets. Zaria leaned her head against the seat, eyes closed but mind alert. Sleep hovered but would not land. In her head. She was back in the conference room at Langford & Moore, where her mentor once told her, You'll have to be better than good. Zaria. You'll have to be twice as prepared and 3 times as calm. Every time. She had nodded, pretending not to mind. That had been 4 years ago. Now here she was. First class, 35,000 feet. Flight VA227. Still needing to explain her seat, her tone, her right to take up space. She thought she had grown past the hurt. But pain has a way of shape-shifting. Sometimes it's sharp like glass. Other times it's soft like exhaustion. Marcus was watching her again. You still thinking about the gate? He asked gently. No, she said, then paused. Yes, maybe. It's not just that. He tilted toward her, resting one elbow along the armrest. What else? Zaria hesitated. Sometimes I wonder if I even want the life I built, or if I'm just trying to prove I deserve it. Marcus didn't respond immediately. Outside, lightning flashed in the distance, followed by a low growl of thunder, too faint to hear, but somehow still felt. Zaria continued, her voice lower now. I've spent my whole career convincing people I belong in rooms they designed to keep me out. I studied the right books, wore the right blazers, smiled the right way in boardrooms, and yet one gate agent with a fake smile can make it all feel like paper. Marcus considered this, then said, You're not paper. Zaria almost laughed. No. Sometimes I feel like origami, folded over and over into a shape people think is elegant, but never ask if I chose it. For a moment, there was only the hum of the engines and the soft rustle of a passing cart. Then Marcus said quietly, You know what I used to tell myself, that if I could just fix the climate equation, or broker one more energy deal, I'd finally feel peace. But peace doesn't come from success. It comes from not needing to explain yourself to survive. Zaria looked at him, really looked. She hadn't known until now how tired he was too. Their lives were different, but the fight was familiar. She leaned back, suddenly aware of the ache in her shoulders. "Do you think it ever ends?" she asked. "What?" "The need to brace yourself." Marcus looked down, fingers absently tracing the seam of his seat cushion. "I think it ends when we stop mistaking endurance for purpose." Zaria didn't respond, but something inside her quietly shifted, like a chair scraping on a tile floor far away. Then, an overhead chime rang out. A voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynard from the flight deck. We've encountered some unexpected headwinds, so we'll be adjusting our altitude. There's also a minor technical issue with the pressure valve on the forward side. Nothing to be concerned about, but we're coordinating with our engineers. Thank you for your patience." A few murmurs floated through the cabin. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Technical issue." Zaria nodded toward the flight attendant up front, who now seemed to be talking in low tones into a discreet phone near the galley. Her stomach tightened. It wasn't fear of flying. It was the sense that something unspoken was about to rise to the surface. In the air, unease travels faster than sound. Minutes passed. Then a man from economy class was quietly ushered forward by a flight attendant. He looked nervous, mid-30s, glasses askew, clutching a tablet. He wore a maintenance lanyard. He sat in one of the jump seats near the front cabin divider and began typing urgently. Zaria watched him. "Crew tech," she murmured. "Maybe the pressure valve's worse than they said." Marcus leaned closer. "You think they'll turn around? Not if they can avoid it, but if they can't stabilize the valve. We'll have to descend. Fast." She had read enough about aerodynamics in her student days, studied pressure gradients. It was supposed to be academic, never something she'd feel in her bones. Then came the second announcement. "This is your captain again. We've been advised to prepare for a precautionary descent due to cabin pressure irregularities. Please fasten your seatbelts and cabin crew. Secure the galley for safety protocol Delta. We'll be descending to 10,000 feet." That wasn't routine. In the seat beside her, Marcus had already buckled in. Zaria did the same. She looked across the aisle. The man in 3C, the one who had questioned her presence earlier, was now gripping his armrest, eyes wide. His bravado dissolved into visible fear. Zaria's jaw tightened. The irony was not lost on her. The cabin lights dimmed further. Oxygen masks hadn't dropped, which meant the issue was still contained. But the change in altitude created a visible reaction. Ears popped. A baby began to cry in the back. Zaria placed a hand on her chest. Her breathing was steady, but she could feel her pulse quicken. Then came the voice again, not over the speaker, but soft and personal. "You okay?" Marcus asked. She nodded. "I'm not afraid of planes." "I know." He waited. She turned to him slowly. "But I am afraid of going my whole life without calling things what they are." Marcus exhaled. "Then don't." Zaria's hands clenched around her armrests, not from fear, but from decision. She had spent years swallowing small humiliations, but no more. Not tonight. When the plane leveled out again, the lights flickered back to a calm, warm glow. The flight attendants resumed quiet movements. They offered water, calming smiles, but the mood in the cabin had changed. Everything felt exposed now. Zaria looked out the window. The sky was still there, endless and strange. "Marcus," she said, without looking at him. "Yeah, if I ever have a daughter. I don't want her to inherit my silence." He didn't answer for a long time. Then, "If you ever have a daughter, I hope she inherits your eyes, because when you look at people, you see everything they're trying to hide." Zaria turned to him, startled by the tenderness. Outside, the clouds began to thin. A distant city shimmered beneath them, clusters of gold like scattered embers. The storm had passed, but something deeper had just begun. The sky outside was still pitch black, but the cabin no longer felt like night. It felt like pause, the kind of stillness right before a verdict is delivered, before a heart either breaks open or hardens for good. Zaria sat upright in her seat, breathing slow. The cabin pressure had stabilized. The descent to 10,000 feet had not triggered oxygen masks, but it had shifted something else, something psychological. A silent unraveling of pretense. The man in 3C no longer wore superiority, only sweat. His fingers trembled as he sipped ginger ale handed to him by a young flight attendant, whose practiced calm was fraying at the edges. Zaria observed him quietly, not with hate, not even with anger now, just with that tired kind of knowing. Beside her, Marcus had drifted into a shallow sleep, arms crossed and head leaned gently toward the aisle. But Zaria's mind remained fully awake. Her thoughts wandered to childhood, to her mother's kitchen in Tallahassee, to lessons she didn't know were lessons at the time. You don't let small people shrink you, her mother once said while cutting okra, but you also don't let them steal your time. Zara had been 7. She didn't understand it then. She did now. She shifted slightly in her seat. Her legs ached from being still too long. Her back throbbed at the base, but none of that mattered as much as the decision settling into her bones. She was going to speak. Not shout, not perform. Speak. Truth had its own gravity. And tonight, it was heavier than ever. A chime sounded. The captain announced they were still cleared for continuing to JFK, pending weather along the corridor. The flight would arrive slightly delayed, but safe. Reassurance wrapped in technical language. Zaria stood. She needed to walk, to think. As she stepped into the aisle, she noticed the eyes that followed her. Some curious, some cautious, a few respectfully averted. She didn't look back. She made her way to the front galley. A flight attendant named Sam, he had introduced himself earlier, stood by the storage carts, checking supplies. His name tag was slightly crooked. "Excuse me," Zaria said gently. He turned. "Yes. Ma'am, everything all right?" She nodded. "I need to speak to your lead." "Not about the turbulence?" Sam tilted his head. "Of course. One moment." He tapped a code on the crew phone and quietly requested, "Camilla," the purser. A few seconds later, a tall woman with auburn curls and kind eyes emerged from the crew quarters. "Miss Monroe," she said, recognizing her from the boarding list. Zaria nodded. "I want to address what happened during boarding. What your gate agent said to me. What another passenger echoed." Camilla's expression softened with a seriousness Zaria appreciated. "I'm listening," Camilla said. "I was asked for proof I belonged in first class. Not once, but twice, by staff, then again by a passenger. No one corrected him. Not then." Camilla pressed her lips together. She didn't interrupt. Zaria continued, "I fly often. I know what codes people use. Are you sure you're in the right section? Do you need help finding your seat?" All of it cloaked as kindness. But it is a form of harm. Death by 1,000 paper cuts. Camilla looked down briefly, then back up. "Thank you for telling me," she said quietly. "I believe you." Zaria didn't expect that sentence to mean as much as it did. But something uncoiled in her chest, just hearing it. Camilla added, "Would you be willing to document this when we land? We're implementing new protocols, but that doesn't mean change happens overnight. People listen more when specifics are written down, Zaria nodded. "I will." Before returning to her seat, she paused. "One more thing," she said. "It shouldn't take turbulence for dignity to be noticed." Camilla nodded solemnly. "It shouldn't." As Zaria turned back toward the cabin, she noticed the man in 3C was watching. His mouth parted slightly, as if about to speak, but he didn't. He just looked at her this time with something closer to regret than arrogance. It wasn't an apology, but it was something. She returned to her seat. Marcus stirred as she sat down. "You all right?" he asked sleepily. "I am now," she replied. His eyes found hers. "What changed? I stopped asking permission to be whole." The words sat between them for a moment, full of weight and light all at once. He smiled. "About time." The cabin lights were now dimmed to soft gold. Somewhere up front, someone clicked on a reading lamp and unfolded a book. The air felt less taut now, more breathable. Zaria picked up her sketch pad, though the page was blank. Not for long. She began to draw. Not buildings this time, not glass structures defying gravity. She drew the aisle of the plane, row by row, seat by seat, but in the place of faces, she drew shadows, and in the middle of it, she drew a girl small, strong, sitting in a chair she earned, surrounded by silence, unshaken by it. She didn't know yet what it would become, but it was hers, her truth, in ink. Suddenly, a voice came over the speaker again, this time not from the cockpit. It was Camilla. "Ladies and gentlemen, we thank you for your patience this evening. In recognition of the minor in-flight disruption and descent, Ventura Air will be providing vouchers and full reporting documentation upon landing. Also, we want to acknowledge all passengers for maintaining calm and courtesy to one another. Your grace does not go unnoticed." Zaria smiled faintly. Grace. That was a word she could carry. She looked at Marcus. He had opened his laptop. A blank document stared back. "What are you writing?" she asked. "A letter," he said, "to the board of Ventura, about what I witnessed tonight." Zaria raised her brows. "You're on the board. I'm an advisor," he said. "But they listen, and if they don't, I'll make them." She watched him with a mix of awe and quiet gratitude. Then she turned back to her window. The stars were fading into the gray glow of early dawn. The world was waking up, and so was she. Zaria couldn't sleep, not after everything. The hum of the engines was no longer comforting background noise. It had turned into something like a heartbeat, constant and low, echoing inside her chest. The cabin was quiet, but her thoughts were alive and restless. Marcus was still typing. Occasionally, he paused to reread a sentence, then would continue with careful fingers, as if each word had weight. Zaria stared at the sketch she'd drawn earlier, the one of the girl alone in the aisle. It wasn't finished. There was still too much space around her. She needed more than just shadows. She picked up her pencil. Row by row, she began adding details, hands, postures, glances, all of it from memory, not of people, but of how their energy felt. Indifference, discomfort, empathy, silence. She drew it all. A tiny cough behind her made her turn. It was a flight attendant Sam again. He looked hesitant, but stepped forward when she met his eyes. "Miss Monroe," he said softly, "Camilla asked me to let you know the captain will be making a statement before landing about what happened earlier. She wanted you to be aware." Zaria blinked. "A public statement." He nodded. "Yes. Apparently. There's already chatter online. Someone in business class posted a vague update. Camilla thought transparency might help. Zaria thought for a moment. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. Part of her wanted it all to fade quietly into the past. Another part of her, the stronger part, felt it was time for accountability. "Thank you, Sam," she said. He gave a small, grateful nod and returned to the galley. Zaria exhaled, long and slow. "Would you want to speak too?" Marcus asked without looking up from his screen. She hesitated. "Me, why? Because you were the one they questioned. The one who stood up and still sat down in peace. That carries more weight than people think." Zaria leaned back in her seat. "I'm not sure anyone wants to hear a black woman talk about being tired of explaining her own existence." Marcus finally looked at her. "That's exactly why they need to hear it." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she thought of her students back home at Columbia, her mentees, especially Yasmin, the freshman who never raised her hand but always had something brilliant to say in her sketches. She thought of the girl from the waiting lounge, the one with the braids and braces, holding her mother's hand, staring wide-eyed at first class like it was a museum. What would she want them to see? Not just strength, stillness, knowing. She picked up her notebook, flipped to a blank page, and began to write. The words didn't come like poetry. They came like truths she had waited too long to say. "I am not your discomfort. I am not your exception. I am not a mystery for you to solve with suspicion. I am a daughter, a citizen, a designer of public space, and I deserve to take up space." She paused, then added, "And when I am quiet, do not mistake it for agreement. When I am kind, do not assume I am comfortable." By the time she finished, the sun had begun to rise outside. A thin gold line painted the horizon. Gentle light spilled through the windows row by row. Zaria looked around. The man in 3C was reading something on his tablet. He glanced up once, met her gaze, and nodded. It wasn't warm. It wasn't icy. But it was human. That felt like enough for now. Minutes later, Camilla returned. She crouched gently by Zaria's row, lowering her voice so it wouldn't carry. "The captain will speak in 10 minutes, she said. "Would you be open to saying a few words afterward? I can give you the intercom from the jump seat. Only if you're comfortable." Zaria felt her pulse quicken. "I'll do it," she said. Marcus didn't say anything. He simply closed his laptop and placed it gently in his bag, a silent way of saying he was with her. 10 minutes passed. Then the familiar chime. "Good morning." "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain said, "this is your captain, Jeremy Clark. I'd like to speak briefly before our final descent into JFK." The cabin quieted. Earlier in this flight, we had an incident that challenged more than our airspeed. It challenged our integrity. One of our passengers, Miss Zaria Monroe, was unfairly questioned about her presence in first class. Not once, but multiple times. A few murmurs rippled through the rows. "We want to be clear," Captain Clark continued. "Ventura Air does not tolerate discrimination of any kind. But tolerance isn't enough. We believe in acknowledgement, accountability, and action. Miss Monroe has agreed to share a few words. I encourage every passenger and every crew member to listen." Camilla handed Zaria the handset. The cabin was utterly still. Zaria stood beside the galley, the intercom cable stretching slightly. Her fingers trembled, but her voice did not. "Good morning," she began. "My name is Zaria Monroe. I'm an architect, a daughter, a mentor, and someone who flies often." Her voice echoed lightly through the plane. A few people looked up. A few shifted in their seats. "Yesterday." I was excited to board this flight. I had earned a milestone contract, one I've worked years toward. But before I could take my seat, I was asked to prove I belonged here. She paused. The question was not, "Can I see your boarding pass?" It was, "Are you sure you're in the right section?" That question might sound innocent. It wasn't. She let it sit. I was then questioned again. Not by staff this time, but by a fellow passenger. And when no one stepped in, it said something louder than any slur could. It said, "You are alone here." The silence in the cabin was now reverent. But I am not alone. I have ancestors who endured ships and shackles so I could one day walk down an aisle like this with my head high. I have mentors who reminded me that intelligence has no color. And I have a voice, one that cannot be revoked by suspicion. Her breath caught just slightly. So, to the girl in the back of the plane, watching this, wondering if she'll ever be treated as equal, you will. Not because they let you, but because you demand it without raising your voice. Because you show up anyway. She glanced down the aisle. "Thank you for listening." She handed the handset back. No applause, just silence. A full, deep, thoughtful kind of silence. And then one by one, people began nodding. A man in 4A wiped his glasses. A woman in 2D murmured thank you. Even the man in 3C gave her a slow, meaningful look, his eyes damp. Zaria returned to her seat. Marcus smiled. "You just rerouted the flight path of a few souls today." She smiled back. Outside, the clouds parted. New York was coming into view, but Zaria had already arrived. The seatbelt sign blinked on as the aircraft began its slow descent toward New York City. The cabin lights adjusted to a soft amber glow, casting long shadows across resting faces and folded tray tables. Zaria sat still, her hands resting in her lap. Her fingers relaxed now. The speech had taken something out of her, but it had also returned something she hadn't realized she'd lost. The right to speak without asking permission. Marcus leaned toward her gently. That was one of the bravest things I've seen in a very long time. She gave him a small, tired smile. It didn't feel brave. It felt overdue. He nodded. Still, that kind of truth doesn't just echo. It builds things. In people. Zaria turned toward the window. Far below, the land had begun to take shape tidy blocks, curling highways, glimpses of water reflecting morning light. And then something caught her eye. A hand, small and hesitant, lifted into the air just past the wing, maybe 6 rows behind her. It was a child, seated alone at the edge of the aisle. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9. Her hair was in twists, her sneakers swung above the floor. Her backpack rested on her lap like a protective shell. Zaria leaned back and looked down the aisle. Camilla noticed too. She began to move toward the child, but paused and turned instead toward Zaria. "Would you mind?" she whispered. Sometimes a familiar face feels safer. Zaria unbuckled her seatbelt. "Of course." She walked carefully down the narrow aisle. The plane shifted under her feet as it angled lower, and she placed one hand along the headrest to steady herself. The little girl looked up. Her eyes were wide, but not frightened, just full of questions that didn't know how to form. "Hi," Zaria said, kneeling beside the seat. "My name's Zaria." "What's yours, Amira?" the girl whispered. "Hi, Amira." "That's a beautiful name." The girl clutched the straps of her backpack. I just wanted to say thank you." Zaria blinked, caught off guard. "Thank you. For what you said. My mom is always telling me not to let people make me feel like I don't belong." But it's hard, especially when they don't say it out loud. They just look at you like you're not supposed to be somewhere. Zaria's throat tightened. I know that look, she said gently. I've seen it since I was your age. It never really stops showing up. But you get better at deciding what it means, or what it doesn't mean. Amira looked down at her shoes. I was in the back when it happened. I wanted to say something, but I didn't know what to say, and nobody else did either. Zaria reached out and touched her hand, just lightly. It's okay. Just seeing is enough sometimes. You saw. You felt it. That's the start. Amira took a breath. You were really calm, even when the man was rude. How do you stay calm? Zaria sat back slightly. Honestly, I wasn't calm. I just looked like I was inside. I was angry, embarrassed, hurt. But I knew if I let that out the way I felt it, some people would stop listening. So I held it, not for them, for me, because I deserved to say what I needed to say without being dismissed as loud or angry or difficult. The girl nodded slowly, as if absorbing a secret truth. Zaria continued, her voice low and warm. People like us, we carry a kind of map, a path made by all the women before us who walked through the same rooms and felt the same stares. But every time we speak, every time we hold our space with grace and fire, we redraw the map, make it easier for the ones behind us. Amira smiled faintly. My teacher says I talk too much in class. Zaria grinned. Good. That means you have things to say. Just make sure you keep learning how to say them better and stronger, not quieter. Camilla approached with a small carton of juice. Mind if I borrow her for a second? Amira took the juice with a quiet thank you and gave Zaria one last look. I'm going to draw you when I get home, she said. Zaria raised her brows. Yeah. Not in first class. Just sitting in your seat. Saying something real. Zaria's heart swelled with something deeper than gratitude. It was legacy, in real time. As she made her way back to her seat, the woman in 2D reached out and touched her arm. Thank you for not staying silent, she said softly. Zaria nodded. Thank you for not looking away. When she sat down again, Marcus handed her his notebook. She looked at it, puzzled. I just wrote down what you told that girl, he said. I think the world needs to hear it, too. She glanced down. His handwriting was neat and deliberate. We redraw the map. The tires met the runway with a soft thud. The cabin tilted forward, brakes engaged, wings flexing slightly against the speed. Ventura Air Flight VA227 had landed, but something else had taken off. Something quieter. Something that would ripple through classrooms and drawing pads and boardrooms for months to come. The passengers began to gather their belongings. A few offered Zaria quiet nods. One even said her name. As she stepped off the plane, Zaria looked back one last time. The jet bridge felt different now. Not an exit. A beginning. Outside. Marcus was already on his phone, arranging a driver. Zaria felt a gentle tug at her coat. It was Amira again. This time with her mother beside her, a woman in her early 30s. Tired eyes but warm posture. I just wanted to say, the mother said quietly, what you did up there, it mattered. To her. To me. Zaria smiled. Thank you. It mattered to me, too. They parted ways at the terminal. The city opened up ahead. Zaria adjusted the strap on her bag. This wasn't just the end of a flight. It was the start of walking taller. The airport concourse buzzed with motion. Families reunited. Business people darted toward baggage claim. A violinist played softly near a marble column, her open case catching crumpled bills and stray coins. Zaria walked without speaking, her heels clicking softly on polished tile. She had walked through hundreds of airports before, but something about this moment sat differently in her chest. It wasn't just the attention, the stares, or the murmurs of recognition from fellow passengers. It was what had settled inside her. A deep stillness, the kind that comes after you've told the truth aloud, and the world, for once, didn't talk over it. Marcus walked beside her, quiet for once. His phone was in his pocket, unread notifications blinking silently. She glanced up at him. "You didn't have to follow me all the way out." He shrugged. "I wanted to. Sometimes it's not about the flight path. It's about the landing." Zaria gave him a soft smile, but her eyes were distant. Behind her words were questions. Why did it take a confrontation for people to see her? Why did she feel more exposed than celebrated? And why was it always on people like her to remain composed in the face of open degradation? They reached the exit where black town cars waited, their drivers holding signs with neatly printed names. Marcus turned to her. "Can I offer you a ride? Just until Brooklyn." She hesitated. Her instinct was always to refuse, to maintain distance, especially from men she barely knew. But Marcus wasn't just anyone now. He had witnessed her humiliation and her strength, and he hadn't turned away. She nodded. Sure. Inside the car, the city rolled past like a series of unfinished thoughts. Billboards, brownstones, parks blurred with motion. Zaria leaned her head against the window. You ever feel like the most exhausting part of being seen is the silence that comes after Marcus turned toward her slowly? Yeah, especially when the silence isn't from peace, but from people figuring out how to spin your story without naming your pain. She closed her eyes. Exactly. A moment passed. Then Marcus asked, "Do you ever wish you had stayed quiet?" Zaria sat up straighter. "No. I wish I had spoken sooner." He nodded, lips pressed into a line. "There's this idea that dignity looks like restraint," she said. "But sometimes dignity is what breaks out when you've held everything in too long." The driver glanced at them briefly through the mirror, as if catching the weight of the conversation without knowing the words. Zaria turned away from the window. "Do you know what it's like to be praised for surviving something that should have never happened in the first place?" Marcus didn't answer right away. "I was born in Ghana," he said eventually, "but I grew up here. D.C. My mother was a nurse, one of the best. She saved lives every day and still came home to neighbors who thought she didn't belong on the block. I remember her getting pulled over on her way to work, 4 times in 3 months. She kept her scrubs folded neatly on the passenger seat so they'd believe she had somewhere real to be." Zaria's throat tightened. She always said, "Stay calm, Marcus, because the world is already nervous when we walk into a room." Zaria looked down at her hands. "That's not fair." "No," he said, "it isn't." They fell into silence again, but this one was different. Shared. Understood. The car pulled up to her apartment building, a renovated brownstone with ivy curling along the fire escape. Before she stepped out, Marcus handed her a small envelope. "What's this?" "An invitation," he said. "There's a global housing summit next week, Geneva. I want you there. Not because of what happened on the plane, but because of what you built before that. You've got a vision. Zaria, I've seen the renderings. I've read your work." She blinked. How he smiled. "I did some research and called in a few favors." Her heart beat faster, but she remained composed. "I'll think about it." He nodded. Not pressing. I hope you do. She stepped out, the door closing behind her with a quiet finality. As the car pulled away, Zaria stood for a moment, envelope in hand. She could hear her mother's voice again. Be twice as good. Smile when it hurts. Take up space, but not too much. But her mother had also said something else. Speak. Zari, even when your voice shakes. Especially then. She went inside. That night, Zaria sat at her drafting table, the apartment quiet except for the occasional rattle of the radiator. She opened the envelope. Inside was not just the invitation. There was a handwritten note. You belong in every room you walk into. The world just needs time to catch up. She stared at the words until they blurred. Then she pulled out her sketch pad. Lines formed quickly. Not buildings this time, but faces. Amira, Camilla, the woman in 2D, even the gate agent, frowning behind the counter. She added herself last, standing not in first class, not at the podium, but in the aisle, speaking, and people listening. For the first time in a long while, Zaria didn't feel like she had to apologize for taking up space. She was the space. And silence, when it followed truth, wasn't always erasure. Sometimes it was respect. Sometimes it was the sound of the world holding its breath. 3 days after the flight, Zaria Monroe received an email that would quietly change the trajectory of her life. It was early morning, the kind of gray-lit hush that makes the city feel paused. Zaria had just poured a cup of dark roast coffee into her chipped white mug. She hadn't yet turned on her phone. The apartment was still and ordinary, exactly what she needed. After everything that happened at 30,000 feet, normalcy felt like a balm. She opened her laptop out of habit more than intention, scrolling past newsletters and spam until a subject line caught her eye. Read Geneva Keynote invitation. Confirm your attendance. It wasn't from Marcus this time. The sender was Marie Lentz, director of the World Housing and Equity Coalition, a name she'd only seen on white papers and global conference brochures. Zaria hesitated. She clicked, Dear Ms. Monroe, following your extraordinary architectural submissions and the deeply resonant moment witnessed on board Flight 100, we would be honored to feature you as a keynote speaker at this year's Global Housing and Equity Summit in Geneva. Your work in community-first urban design has not only reached us, it has inspired us. Please confirm your attendance by Friday. Travel arrangements will be coordinated through Mr. S. Levan's office. Warm regards, Marie Lentz, Executive Director, GHEC. Zaria's hand slowly lowered the coffee mug to the table. Her eyes didn't move. She read the email 3 more times before breathing out loud. Keynote speaker. Her, not as a side note, not as a token, not as the supporting voice to someone else's platform. Her voice, her designs, her experience, her grief, her anger, her hope, all of it. For years, Zaria had been writing proposals, leading small builds, redesigning rooftops in neighborhoods long ignored by city planners. She had filled binders with community interviews, scribbled drawings of street parks, held forums in laundromats and library basements. No one had ever invited her to speak internationally. Until now, and somehow, a seat denied on a plane had opened a stage no one had ever offered. She stared at the blinking cursor of the reply window. She closed the laptop instead. She wasn't ready to answer yet. Later that morning, she walked to the corner cafe near Fort Greene Park. It was the kind of place where people knew her name, but didn't ask too many questions. Zaria liked that balance. Familiarity without intrusion. As she sipped her second coffee of the day, this one oat milk, lighter, less bitter. She noticed the barista looking at her. "You were on that flight, right?" he asked carefully. "The one everyone's talking about." She nodded slowly. The young man lowered his voice. "What you said. The way you stood there. It mattered. My sister's been talking about it nonstop. She's 12. Wants to be an architect now." Zaria swallowed hard. "Thank you," she said quietly. That was the 4th time in 2 days someone had recognized her. And not because she was famous, because she had refused to shrink. Later that afternoon, she opened her sketchpad again. But this time, the lines weren't just of buildings or people. She sketched a space. Not a home, not a school, something in between. A place for girls like Amira. A space for safety, vision, and voice. She labeled it Horizon House. And under the name, she wrote a single line, "Where your story begins, not where it ends." She stared at the page for a long time. Then she flipped back to her laptop and opened her email again. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard, but before she could type her reply, another notification appeared. Incoming statement from Aurora Air CEO, Marcus Levin. She blinked. It was trending. She clicked the headline. A video began to autoplay. Marcus stood in a plain conference room. No podium, no branding behind him. Just a man and a single microphone. What happened aboard Flight 187 should not have happened. The denial of dignity is a structural issue, not a personal misunderstanding. Zaria Monroe is not only my guest and a brilliant architect. She is a mirror for all of us. What we tolerate, what we allow to go unseen, what we silently excuse. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. As of today, Aurora Air is launching a full audit of all training protocols, partnership staffing, and internal reporting systems, because apologies without action are just performance. Zaria sat still, the weight of his words wrapping around her like a coat she hadn't asked for, but desperately needed. He wasn't just backing her privately. He had gone public. He was risking his own position, his career, his name, to call the thing what it was, discrimination. And still, part of her didn't know how to receive that kind of solidarity. When you've been expected to carry so much alone, help can feel suspicious, even when it's real. That evening, as dust settled over Brooklyn, Zaria replied to Marie Lentz's email. "Dear Miss Lentz, thank you for your invitation and for seeing the heart of my work. I would be honored to speak in Geneva. I believe we must reimagine not just housing, but the systems that determine who is heard, who is safe, and who is allowed to lead. I look forward to building that vision together. Warmly, Zaria Monroe." She clicked send, and for the first time in weeks, maybe even years, she felt light. Not because the world was fixed, but because something had shifted, and she was no longer asking for permission to be part of it. She was already in motion. Zaria Monroe had never flown in a jet that quiet. The private charter arranged by the summit organizers lifted off from JFK just before dawn. There were no boarding announcements, no gate changes, no one questioning why she was there. Just a flight attendant named Ava, who offered her tea with gentle hands and a softness in her voice that Zaria hadn't realized she needed. She wore a loose cardigan over her usual black turtleneck, fingers tucked under the blanket as the plane climbed above the cloud line. She didn't sleep. Instead, she sat upright with her sketchbook open, flipping through pages of lines that had once been theoretical, streetscapes, shared rooftops, tiny parklets built into old alleys. They were more than ideas now. They were blueprints for something she could finally say out loud. And still, Doubt coiled in the pit of her stomach. She wasn't afraid of speaking. She had addressed rooms before, even crowds. But Geneva wasn't about the speech. Not really. It was about being seen for something other than resistance. It was about stepping on stage not because she survived injustice, but because she created beauty in spite of it. The plane touched down at Geneva International just after noon. Crisp air and bright sun greeted her. A car with tinted windows whisked her to the conference hotel, a modern structure wrapped in green glass. She barely noticed it. Her mind was already inside the Keynote hall. Later that evening, Zaria stood in front of the hotel mirror, smoothing the hem of her navy blue dress. It was simple, sleeveless, pockets deep enough for a pen. She wore her hair in a soft twist, lips neutral, eyes focused. Her fingers trembled only once, when she reached for the silver pendant around her neck. It had belonged to her mother. A quiet reminder that roots never vanish. Downstairs, the hall was already full. Delegates from 50 nations, scholars, architects, activists, tech innovators. When her name appeared on the giant screen, followed by the words community architect and systems designer, there was a hush, then a rising wave of applause. She walked slowly to the podium. She didn't look down at her notes. Instead, she looked out into the crowd and began. Where I come from, the shape of a neighborhood often decides the shape of a life. Silence followed, not from disinterest, but focus, Zaria continued. In communities like the one I was raised in, beauty wasn't optional, it was a lifeline. And yet our spaces were often built by people who never lived among us, never asked what we needed, never stayed to see what happened when the sun went down. She paused. The room held its breath. I became an architect not just to build structures, but to reimagine who gets to feel safe in them, who gets to dream inside them, who gets to call them home. She spoke of rooftop gardens in forgotten zones, of modular libraries attached to laundromats, of playgrounds made from deconstructed barriers. But she also spoke of the flight, not in anger, in clarity. 3 weeks ago, I was denied a seat I had been given because someone couldn't imagine I belonged in it. But what they couldn't take from me was my blueprint, my voice, my right to build. By the time she closed her speech, the standing ovation rose like thunder. It wasn't just for the words, it was for the presence. She had shown up whole. After the ceremony, people approached her one by one. A minister from Nairobi, a housing developer from Brazil, a nonprofit director from New Zealand. They didn't just want to shake her hand. They wanted to collaborate. Zaria excused herself from the crowd and stepped outside. The Geneva air was cold and sharp, the kind that slices through thought and wakes you up. She stood beneath a birch tree and let herself feel it. All of it. Pride, relief, grief, the joy of being believed. And then she heard footsteps behind her. Marcus. He wore a simple gray suit, no tie. His expression unreadable. You are extraordinary, he said gently. Zaria looked away. It didn't feel extraordinary. It just felt overdue. He nodded. I didn't come out here to talk about the airline, he added, or the policy changes, or even the fallout. I came because I owe you something I didn't say in front of everyone. She turned slowly toward him. What's that? Marcus's voice lowered. I'm sorry it took something public for me to act on what should have been personal. I should have spoken up the second it happened, not after. Zaria folded her arms. You did what most men in your position do. You calculated. You watched. Then you acted when the risk was gone. He didn't flinch. You're not wrong. She looked at him, eyes tired but honest. I don't want to be anyone's catalyst for redemption. Marcus, I want to build a world where no one needs to be. His voice softened. Can I help build that world for a long time? She said nothing. Then quietly, only if you're ready to follow, not lead. They stood in silence under the tree, not as a couple, not as rivals, just two people staring at a future that could still be changed. Later that night, in her hotel room, Zaria opened her journal. She wrote one line across the top. Geneva was never just about the speech. Then she began to sketch. Not buildings this time, people, a row of women holding hands, a child standing tall, a flight attendant bowing her head, a CEO listening, not talking, a new language of dignity, drawn in graphite and sealed with truth. The sun had already begun to dip below the Swiss horizon when Zaria Monroe zipped up her suitcase. She took one last glance at the room that had held her silence and her thunder alike. The thick curtains, the half-full cup of mint tea, the still open window that let in the cool Geneva air. She touched the silver pendant at her throat, her mother's. Her fingers lingered there, absorbing a memory that wasn't just personal anymore. She was no longer just the girl from Eastwood whose seat was stolen in silence. She had become the woman who spoke in front of nations. And still, she craved something smaller, something real. The drive back to the airport was uneventful. Her driver, a man named Theo, hummed a quiet jazz tune as he navigated the turns. She liked him instantly. He didn't ask questions. When they arrived, there was no media at the gate, no camera flashes, no handlers, just a regular boarding pass and a return flight to New York. Zaria stepped into the terminal and paused. There was something different about the way she walked now. She wasn't shrinking to fit the space anymore. She belonged. She always had. As she approached the gate, she noticed a girl, maybe 7, maybe 8. She wore a red hoodie and sat cross-legged by the window, building towers out of plastic cups from a nearby cafe. Her mother sat close, head down, scribbling on a notepad. The exhaustion in her shoulders was familiar. Zaria smiled. She had once been that girl. And that mother? When she boarded, the air inside the plane was cool and soft, like a fresh canvas. This time, she had chosen economy, not because she lacked the option, but because she wanted to remember. She settled into her seat beside a quiet, middle-aged woman in a brown trench coat who nodded kindly but said nothing. Zaria didn't mind. She slipped her sketchbook into the seat pocket and leaned her head back, closing her eyes for a moment until a familiar voice came over the cabin speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Ramos. We've got a clear sky ahead and expect a smooth journey. On behalf of Aurora Air, thank you for choosing to fly with us today. Zaria opened her eyes. Aurora Air. Of course, she almost chuckled. The irony wasn't lost on her. Not 5 minutes later, a flight attendant approached her row. A man in his late 30s, warm face, sharp uniform. He smiled gently. Miss Monroe. She blinked. Yes, we'd like to offer you a seat in first class, if you'd allow it. Her seatmate turned slightly, curious. Zaria sat still. No, thank you, she said. I'm comfortable here. The attendant hesitated. Are you sure it's a personal request from Mr. Levan? Zaria tilted her head. Tell Mr. Levan. I appreciate it, but comfort isn't always found in the front of the plane. The attendant nodded once. No argument. Zaria smiled and returned to her seat. This time, she opened her sketchbook. Page 1, a playground beneath a freeway overpass. Page 2, a neighborhood cafe with childcare in the back and poetry nights every Friday. Page 3, an airport waiting room redesigned with color, culture, and care. She turned to a blank page and began to draw. Somewhere near mid-flight, the woman beside her finally spoke. "I know who you are," she said softly. Zaria didn't turn. "Do you?" The woman nodded. "I watched your speech in Geneva. My daughter sent me the link. Said, 'Mama, she sounds like you.'" Zaria smiled gently. "What did you think I thought it was about time someone told the truth with grace? And I thought, maybe, I'm not too old to believe in things again." They both laughed quietly. Before landing, the pilot spoke again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be descending shortly into JFK. On behalf of our entire crew, and especially our CEO, Mr. Levon, we'd like to thank a very special passenger aboard today's flight, Miss Zaria Monroe. Thank you for reminding us who the skies really belong to." There was a pause in the cabin, then scattered applause. Zaria felt her cheeks flush. She wasn't used to public thanks, but she took a breath, and this time, she didn't shrink from it. She sat taller. Outside baggage claim. Marcus Levon stood with a simple placard. It read, "Welcome home." She paused before walking up to him. No entourage, no security, just him. "Did you really have to use the PA system?" she asked. He grinned. "Technically, it wasn't me," Ramos insisted. She raised a brow. "You planted that seed." "Maybe, but they all meant it." Zaria sighed. "So what now?" Marcus looked out across the terminal. "Now, we build something new. Not for optics, not for the board, but for every girl who sat quietly when her voice should have been heard." She didn't answer. Instead, she pulled out a folded paper from her coat. "Here's a proposal. 12 airports, public art, local youth commissions, representation, human connection." He scanned it. "You're asking for a budget larger than our entire current DEI department." Zaria looked him square in the eye. "That's the point." He folded the paper carefully. "Approved, but only if you lead it." "I'll lead the vision," she replied. "But the voices leading each airport, they won't be mine." Marcus nodded. As she walked toward the waiting car, Zaria stopped suddenly. She turned back. "One more thing," she said. He looked up. She held his gaze. "You don't get to call me daughter. Not here. Not now." He didn't flinch. "I know." Zaria climbed into the car. As the door closed, she saw the red hoodie of the little girl from earlier stepping out of arrivals with her mother. They locked eyes. Zaria smiled, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the word future, not as a wish, but as a certainty. As the car pulled away from the terminal, Zaria opened her sketchbook again. She wrote in the margin, "First class is not a seat. It's a mindset, a blueprint, a place where no child's voice is treated like turbulence, where truth flies higher than silence, where power means responsibility, not rank." She closed the book. Outside the window, the skyline of New York shimmered in the distance. This time, it didn't tower over her. It met her eye to eye. Zaria Monroe never raised her voice, but her story echoed across boardrooms, airports, and hearts that had long forgotten what courage sounded like. She didn't seek revenge. She demanded recognition. In a world where seats are stolen in silence and smiles mask injustice, Zaria didn't just reclaim her place, she redefined what first class means. Her journey reminds us discrimination doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, it apologizes, it smiles while it erases you. But voices like Zaria's, they remind us that every quiet act of dignity is louder than a headline. To everyone who's been overlooked, dismissed, or moved to the back, you are not invisible, and you are not alone. If this story moved you, share it, speak it, stand up next time someone is asked to sit down quietly. And as always, like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more true stories that shine a light on injustice and celebrate the quiet strength that changes everything. Because sometimes, the most powerful rebellions begin with just one word: no.